Welcome to the Care to Share podcast, brought to you by Oakland Care, a luxury care home provider in the southeast of England. I'm Rachel. Each episode I will be joined by guests to talk about what you need to know when moving a loved one into a care home. We will give you practical advice and also show you what life is like inside our care homes to show you the truly positive side of elderly care. Hi everyone, and welcome to season 2 of the Care to Share podcast. Today we're going to talk about care home funding, paying for a care home, the legalities and what can be involved when moving into a care home, including wills, probate and lasting powers of attorney. This could be considered quite a confusing subject for those who are looking to move a loved one into a care home. And to help shed some light and insight into this subject, we are joined today by Pauline Cichy, Director of Care and Governance at Oakland Care, and Nino, Cuffaro, a qualified private client solicitor. Pauline has been a registered nurse and midwife for many, many years. Her clinical specialities are oncology, end-of-life care and major surgery. Nino is a private client solicitor. His expertise lends itself to advising individuals and families and trustees in inheritance tax, capital gains tax, succession planning, probate matters and trusts. And he also has a wealth of experience in the care sector, assisting families and vulnerable adults with their social care needs and mental capacity challenges. Welcome, Pauline and Nino.
Thank you.
Would you like to start by just giving a little bit more of an introduction on what you do day to day? Pauline, if we start with you.
Okay, hello. Yes, I'm the Director of Care and Governance with Oakland Care. My background is, as Rachel says, and I'm responsible for the policies, procedures and the actual care that we give to our residents, just to make sure that it's person-centred, that people have appropriate care plans, and I give advice on elements of what we're going to talk about today. I'm not an expert. The expert is Nino, but I do have experience of working with it.
Great, thank you. And Nino?
Thank you for that, Pauline. I don't know necessarily that I'm an expert in all things, but I actually started life when I had hair as an accountant many years ago, and then worked for a number of years in the care sector. And eventually my desire to work in law was finally realised when I qualified as a solicitor. And so because of my background and because of the area of law that I wanted to work in, I work in wills, trusts, probate matters, mental capacity issues, and of course contested probate. So where wills or these matters aren't done properly, things can often lead to litigation, which all families want to avoid as far as possible.
Great, thank you. Okay, so could we start by discussing probably one of the biggest questions that families may have when moving a loved one into a care home? Obviously, it's a very difficult decision emotionally, but also financially. So could you just give an overview on kind of the funding area of care homes and what families can expect when they start looking, and what they might need to pay for, and when they may be able to get support?
Okay, well, my funding experience is fairly limited to the time that I spent in care. Clearly, there's private funding, which is particularly expensive for families planning and for adult children or the wider support network that families have. And of course, we all know and fighting the challenge against dementia funding not being available, as say, social care, social needs would be. But of course, when funds do run dry, people can look at, taking money out of their property, which is not always a possibility, A, and B, not always necessarily what families want to do. But of course, local authority funding is available to a limit. And then there's the real challenge of continuing healthcare, which should be available. I mean, Pauline, you'd know better than me as a nurse, but my understanding is that continuing healthcare is available to those that have primarily nursing needs. I found my experience with obtaining continuing healthcare funding is that the person almost has to be at death's door and sometimes I've seen that challenges where certain issues are provided for nursing, that need is then considered no longer a need because it's now fixed because of the nursing care, and the continuing healthcare is withdrawn, which just simply doesn't make sense to me. But it is a challenge that families face all the time, and obviously because of budgetary restrictions, I can't necessarily see that it's going to get better in the short term.
No, I think you're right.
Okay, so that's funding kind of for different needs. So it's kind of assessed on needs. So, for example, at Oakland Care, we have residential care, dementia care, and nursing care. So people are assessed on different levels. Is that kind of what you're saying? And there's a different level of funding available for nursing.
Yeah, so there is a nursing element where residents will get a nursing contribution weekly. Not all families, from my experience in the care sector, not all families are aware of that, and the care homes are great in bringing that to the family's attention. But it's a fairly paltry sum when you consider the cost of care. Pauline, I can't remember what the up to date figure is. It was somewhere in the region of 150, 160 pounds a week.
I think it's 200 now. It's just gone up.
200. Okay, so when you consider that say a private paying care home, from my recollection, the entry level was around £1,000 a week, and that was if you really didn't have needs, let's say healthcare needs, more of a social need, let's say. So that doesn't really go much towards it. And of course, that's, if I'm right, that's only available if you have a nursing need.
Yeah.
And going back to the dementia issue, I don't think that qualifies as a nursing need, and so it's a struggle for sure to get funding.
Yeah, definitely. So people may be concerned then that they might have to sell their house, for example. Could you just talk a little bit around if that would happen and what the circumstances would be to try and protect their house and some of their assets?
Okay. So before considering selling a property, there are other options available. A decent financial advisor would be able to advise on products that will allow people to withdraw some equity from their property and fund, whether that's to purchase an annuity or to withdraw funds like an equity release type mortgage, let's say, to pay for funding. But often, the funds in the property aren't enough. But then, of course, you've got the other issue where you have husband and wife, let's say, living in a property together. One of the parties need care, and the other one remains in the home. So typically, around when the financial assessment's done, if the person's still remaining in the home is over 60, the property's disregarded.
Okay.
In most cases, so the resident can then move into the property. So and that of course then yes, it's disregarded, but then it still leaves an option for families to raise capital on that property should they need it. And that might not be to pay for care; it might be to fund their pension. Obviously, people are not working later on in life after they've retired, so it could be that they need that money just to pay the bills and to eat. And with the cost of living crisis we're facing today, that's it's a problem that's bigger than ever.
No, definitely. Okay. So moving on to your area of expertise, Nino, did you want to talk about wills and what you would advise people to do, protecting their estate, for example, from care home fees? Did you want to talk around that area?
Yeah, okay. Wills can often come across as a really boring topic, but I think they can be quite exciting. My strapline is I try to put a bit of life back into death, and a will. A will is a document that obviously we draft in our lifetimes. We make in our lifetimes, but it comes to life on our death. But I'm every day I'm surprised at the number of people that don't have one. Interestingly, the youngest person I've ever done a will for is 18. And a couple of weeks ago, I received an instruction for someone to do their will. Never done a will before. 100 years old. Fantastic.
Wow.
Planning for the future. And but the point is, I think as soon as everybody turns 18, they ought to have a will. And the reason for that is because it's the document itself allows people to make provisions for family members, loved ones, people that they, charities, or political parties. I'm not necessarily sure that that's a particularly popular bequest amongst most people. But the problem is not the will; it's not having one, because if people die without a will, they don't get to decide who receives their assets. There's a prescribed legal process for what happens if someone dies without a will. But of course, if we get a change in government, they could well change that. And so,
what is that legal process then? If somebody dies without a will, what happens to their?
So if there's a married couple, the surviving spouse will receive some of that. If there are children, they'll equally receive some of it. With today's modern family dynamics, where people are living together and not married, if you're living with a partner and you die, the surviving partner gets absolutely nothing. And I've come across people that have been living together for 50, 60 years, albeit as, in any kind of regular marital setup, and often, quite shocked when they realise when their partner dies that they actually receive nothing. I mean, there is talk about changing that. There's discussions in Parliament as to whether there should be legislation to protect surviving partners. But as with all these things, they're discussed for a long time, slow to change. But the way to make sure that your loved ones or the people that you want to receive your assets, your estate, and that's to make a will. But it goes beyond that. I said that people ought to do these things when they're younger. There are other things that you can do in a will. For example, children. If couples have children under the age of 18, I know this is going off the topic of care homes, but if people have children that are under the age of 18, if both parents die together, unless you put a guardianship clause in the will to say who's going to look after that child, the law will determine who looks after that child. So there are many triggers as to why people ought to make a will. But the other thing is there can often be a fallout with families. For example, a family member has looked after their mother, grandmother, father, whatever, and other children haven't been involved at all, and that person really wants to leave their estate to the person that's helped them the most. And even though if the intention's there, unless it's expressly written down, it doesn't happen. And then, of course, there can be all sorts of litigious issues which cost many, many thousands of pounds and often eat up the value in the estate. And the only people that make any money out of that are the lawyers. And I always say to people, don't litigate, get yourself a simple will. It costs a few £100s and it's money well spent, and it can save hundreds of thousands.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's really good advice. And like you say, for young and old. So not just for those coming to the end of their life in care homes. So what happens, so this will often happen in care homes, a resident due to dementia or other issues may not have mental capacity and may not be able to make decisions themselves around finance and also health. So could you talk a little bit about the lasting power of attorneys? And I know, Pauline, you know a bit about this as well.
So I think actually before even talking about lasting powers of attorney, you picked up a very good point around mental capacity. And one of the other reasons to make a will as soon as possible is that you can only make a will if you have capacity. And the test for capacity it comes from a very old case, Banks and Goodfellow, even before I was born, and essentially the judge in that case set out certain criteria as to the test that people need to meet in order to make a will. Now, the older we get, and if there are if there's cognitive impairments, a person may not be able to make a will simply because they don't understand the will, or they don't have they don't meet the requisite test to satisfy whether or not they have capacity. There are mechanisms where the Court of Protection can approve what's called a statutory will, but again, they're expensive avenues to go down, and it's kind of a bit like shutting the door after the horse is bolted. But to your point, Rachel, about lasting powers of attorney, again, capacity is key there. The one thing that many don't realise is that you can't make a lasting power of attorney unless you have the requisite capacity to do so, and the Mental Capacity Act sets up what that test is. It's kind of similar to the test for wills, but it's not as strict. But I suppose we need to understand what a lasting power of attorney is in the first place. A lasting power of attorney is a document. There are two: one for property and financial affairs, one for health and welfare decisions. And it's a document which allows people to set down who they want to make decisions for them in the event that they should lose capacity. Number one, and how those decisions can be made. And it allows for certain preferences to be taken down, certain instructions. Someone I drafted a lasting power of attorney for, and they said, well, if I move into a care home, it has to be in this particular part of the country, in this county. Another chap was a music lover, and he said, look, I like this music. He says, but if I have dementia later on in life, I might not remember. He said, but I know it's going to make me happy. So he said, I want you to draft in my lasting power of attorney that I want my family to play this music to me on a Sunday, which was great. I mean, I never would have thought about that as a lawyer, because I didn't know him, and his family may not have considered that. But of course, the fact that he put that into a lasting power of attorney was important. And then there are other issues that you can put in there around end of life care.
Yeah.
Very important. And I think we tend to not to want to think about death or sort of like end of life and care when we're younger. But of course, it's a very important thing. And some people want specific things around that. But the documents themselves, once they're drafted, they're registered with the Court of Protection, the Office of the Public Guardian. And they sit there, a bit like an insurance policy, I suppose. Okay. It's a bit like having car insurance. If you never have an accident, has the car insurance been a waste of money? Not really. Lasting powers of attorney are a bit like that. You register them hoping that you'd never have to use them. Yeah. Of course, if that moment comes where someone is deemed to not have capacity, the power of attorney kicks in, and the people that you choose can make decisions as if they were you. They stand in your shoes and make the decisions that you would want them to make.
So when should people consider making a lasting power of attorney? Because like you say, you don't want to wait until that point when it's too late. But also, again, it's a difficult kind of thought process to have. When am I going to do this? Because I know that, like you say, they're quite easy to do. They're not too expensive. But what is it like a will? Should everyone have one in place over the age of 18?
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask the question, actually. Yes, and I think quite often people will come to me and make a will, and I'll mention lasting powers of attorney. Of course, one is about dying, one is about living, and so but I think people should do them when they're young and able to understand what they want. I think the older people get, I think differently now to how I did when I was a younger man, and I look at my parents and they'll think differently too. And I think people feel more vulnerable when they're older. And so I think if you can make them as young as you possibly can, there is a consideration that things can change through life.
Yeah, I was going to ask, someone change. Yeah.
Well, you can take someone off as an attorney, but you can't then add someone on once it's registered, which is a shame, really. And I think that ought to be looked at. There are changes coming along with lasting powers of attorney anyway, and the way they're registered and the way they're administered. But again, I think as young as possible. One of the other things I think people ought to do is have more than one attorney. I mean, people have the habit of dying. or losing capacity or being unable to make those decisions for you. So if I, Pauline, if I choose you and then you're unable to make that decision and I've got no one in reserve, then, I'm really back to square one. So I often advise people to consider more than one attorney, whether that be a joint attorney or someone as a substitute, should that person or people that we've chosen be unable to act. But yeah, very much as early as possible, because the truth is, when people think of powers of attorney, they think of old people, and it's a myth that I think we want to dispel, because any one of us could walk out in the street, hit by a bus, and we're in a coma for 6 months. And what happens then? That can happen to a young person, and who makes decisions for that person whilst they're unable to do so? It doesn't. They're not. I always say, forget dementia, think COVID, think car crash, think cancer, think of all the things that can happen to us in our lives that aren't age related. And consider what would we want to happen if that were to happen to us or our loved ones. So yeah, I'd encourage everyone to make one as early as possible.
Great, thank you for that. So they, like we said, they don't cost very much. We can put a link in the notes to where you can go on a website, because I believe it is just a website that you can go to start the process. Is a solicitor required for a lasting power of attorney?
Not legally, no. But I suppose I think it's always a good idea to get advice. I've seen, both with powers of attorney and with wills, I've seen people doing DIY documents, and on the whole, lasting powers of attorney are fairly simple to do. Wills aren't. So I think advice is critical, and the current registration fee is £82 per lasting power of attorney. A solicitor, depending on the requirements, on the advice needed, could be anywhere to a few £100s to several £100s. And even if you speak to a solicitor, and have a consultation and then go off and do your lasting powers of attorney yourself, I think it's better than not taking any advice at all. Of course, there are some people with Pauline, for example, having a care background, yes, of course, understands how the mechanisms, how they work, and the importance and what to put in the lasting powers of attorney. But someone without a background that lends itself to the questions that are going to be asked around lasting powers of attorney, I think it's always a good idea to get advice.
Yeah,
I think the wording's got better from the Office of the Public Guardian. I think they actually asked the question now: if you were to die, what would you like to happen with something? So it does sort of put the idea into someone's head what they should say. But I'm a strong believer, as Rachel knows, because I talk a lot about care planning and end of life. Excuse me. And I talk to very young people, the carers are in their 20s, and I do go on at length about the importance of having lasting power of attorney when you're this age, and a will. And as you say, it's £82 each and 300. So say it's £1,000 maximum if you're fairly straightforward. And then you've got peace of mind while you're living. And when you die, and people do look at me as if I'm crazy. But a few of the carers have come back to me and said, can you direct me, where to go? And I think it's vital, absolutely vital.
Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah. It is. Definitely. So one thing that we haven't touched on yet, which we did mention, was probate. Can you explain that, please, and what it is?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to die. So it's that's the entry level. But essentially, probate is the mechanism through which the assets of the deceased are then passed to the beneficiaries, whether it be the intended beneficiaries through a will, or whether it be the beneficiaries that are prescribed by law. So if you don't have a will, there's the rules that are called the rules of intestacy apply, and that's where Parliament determines who gets what. And so it requires, quite simply, a valuation of the estate, whatever that may be. And it could be that, someone doesn't have a property and they've got a small bank account. In cases like that, if the estate is under, say, £5,000, no probate is required. But if it's beyond that, and obviously, if you own a property, particularly if it's in the southeast, it can run into hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Then those assets can't be passed to the beneficiaries until you get what's called either a grant of probate, or in the event that's if there's a will, and if there's no will, letters of administration. It's the same thing, but it's just called something different. And essentially, it's a certificate that's sealed by the court. And that gives the person dealing with the estate the authority to transfer the assets or to sell the assets and then, distribute the estate to the intended beneficiaries. People often think that when they come to me to make a will, say, well, if I make a will, I don't need to do probate. That's not the case. That's a complete myth. The probate is more often than not required. And it can take, and the courts are fairly backlogged at the moment, so it can take anywhere between 4 to 6, 7 months to obtain a grant of probate. And that's from submission to the court. Obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be done beforehand to value the estate. Once the valuation of the estate is done, and estates can have properties, investment properties, stocks, shares, cash, other investments, and they need to be valued. And an application is sent into HMRC, and who will determine whether or not there's any inheritance tax to pay. That horrible word.
So, sorry, would that be before or after somebody sells? Say, for example, it was a house. Would they sell the house first, and then, or is it valued?
Well, here's the thing: the taxman wants his money first. So if you've got an estate that's worth, say, a couple of £1 million, let's say, and there's inheritance tax is due on that estate, and it's not always the case that big estates pay inheritance tax, because there are many exemptions that could apply, but which are too detailed to go into on this podcast. But let's assume that an amount of tax is due, say £100,000. Taxman wants that first before they'll sign off the estate as one that qualifies for a probate, a grant of probate to be issued. HMRC then inform the court, and the court, once satisfied, will issue the grant of probate. Now, so the question you might ask is, well, how do I pay for? How to pay £100,000 if I'm inheriting this money from my grandmother? I haven't got the money. Quite often, these estates have cash in them, and so banks will allow, in certain circumstances, the cash to be used to pay the taxman, and they'll pay the taxman directly. Other times, there is no cash; it's just a property, and so arrangements can be made with the revenue with HMRC and with the courts to issue a grant of probate before the tax is paid. Sometimes, if that's not available, then sometimes funders are available. A bit like bridging loan companies, really, will fund the tax. The grant of probate is issued. Then the assets are sold, and then it can be paid off. That's a fairly expensive way of doing it, but there are mechanisms available.
It sounds quite complicated, and like we say, it's a consideration you don't often want to think about. It's not just for people that have moved somebody into a care home. That is for everybody, isn't it? But it's important to know that information, and most people, I would say, don't, unless they've been through that circumstance, wouldn't know a lot of that information. So I think that's really useful. Is there any advice you have, any last tips or anything like that on the subjects that we've just covered, or anything else that you want to add into that?
Well, look, I think get advice early is key, and sometimes there are families that will come to me, and they're quite happy with the laws in place that will essentially administer their estate without a will, and that's fine. And there are other families that will say, well, I want to do this straight away. I suppose one of the things, the cost is always an issue, and it's always a consideration for people whether they can afford it or struggling to afford it. there's many cases where I do it myself, where solicitors will do work pro bono for people that are in need. But of course, things like, one of the things with the lasting power of attorney, I talked about, needing capacity in order to be able to make one. But of course, it doesn't end there. If someone then is in care and they don't have capacity, and someone will require access to their funds in order to pay for things, or whether it be receive benefits, manage those funds, pay for whatever it is that they need. If you don't have a lasting power of attorney, it's not the end of the road. You can apply to the court for what's called a deputyship application to manage those financial affairs. That's a rather lengthy process, because if someone makes a lasting power of attorney whilst they have capacity, you make the decision. If you lack capacity and then you can't make a lasting power of attorney, and the application's got to go into the court of protection, a judge will decide whether a person or persons are the right people to make financial decisions for that person. That's infinitely more expensive. It takes a very long time. I've already talked about the backlog in the courts. If you imagine that's got to get before a judge, and the judge has got to consider whether you are the right person making the application to make decisions for your grandmother, your wife, your husband, your brother, whatever that may be. So again, I just think take advice, even if it means that based on that advice you do nothing, at least you have the information.
Yeah, the awareness. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. I just wanted to, obviously you're both got care backgrounds. Pauline, you still work in the care industry. The podcast is to give people practical information, which I think we've definitely done there, but we also want to, and in forthcoming episodes we'll talk about what really happens in care homes, and definitely the positive and all the wonderful things that happen. So if you both have kind of a myth or a perception of what people might consider care homes to be like, and any anecdotes or stories that can dispel that would be really nice to hear, just to end on a nice uplifting note. Pauline, if you...
Shall I start? Well, I think...
I don't. Yeah, Pauline or Nino, whoever.
I think a lot of people, certainly a lot of my friends, think that care homes are institutions, that they're a bit smelly, and when you go in there, you all sit in a circle and you do nothing all day. And I think that's something also that the media sort of put across as well. If you think of during COVID, a lot of the publicity around care homes was not good publicity.
Not at all, no.
A lot of us were doing really, really good things to keep our residents safe and active and all that. So we'll blame them for a bit of that. But I think, certainly from an Oakland Care perspective, we have a sort of positive, what I call a positive risk attitude. So when we have our residents come to us, we allow them to do more or less what they want to do, but within a safe environment. We encourage them to look after themselves as much as they can. We encourage them to have their friends and family around. We encourage them to go out, and we facilitate those outings. So we keep life as fairly normal, and it is definitely not institutional.
No.
And from the smell perspective, in my humble opinion, there is no excuse for a smelly care home in this day and age. And if it is, it's because it's either not being cleaned properly or something's happened that needs to be put right. So I can guarantee that when you come to our care homes, you'll only smell maybe the dinner cooking or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you. And Nino?
No, I concur with a lot of what Pauline said, and I think there is this myth that care homes are institutions. Certainly, before I had a brief spell in the care sector, I had that myth. I'd never been into a care home. I don't think. I mean, I might have done as a young kid at school, maybe when we did some work experience. But actually, when I went into a care home for work reasons, it was completely different. Pauline mentioned the cooking was great. It was fabulous, and care homes, I think, when certainly I if I'm talking to someone about looking for a care home, I would say three things. One, yes, the smells, but two, the food. Try the food and activities. Activities are great, and because I think people have this myth that when people retire or they go and live in a care home, they just want a day off. I don't think that's the case. So I think people want to be busy. Look, there's times when you want downtime and you'd like someone to make a cup of tea. But I think generally people want to be busy. On the subject of tea, I remember one occasion, and I think this really changed my perception of what a care home really does for people. I walked into a care home and I was dressed in a suit, and there was a resident said to me, "Are you the doctor?" And I said, "I'm not." And she said, "Go on then, go make us a cup of tea." And I went off to make this lovely resident a cup of tea, and a carer came past and she said, I'll do that. I said, "It's fine." I said, I've got some time. I'll make her a cup of tea. It's fine. She said, No, please, I need to do it. Anyway, so I went off, but just as I was, just before I went around the corner, I saw this carer, coax this resident out of her chair. And she was complaining. She said, "Hey, he said he was going to make me a cup of tea. Why have I got to do it?" And I was quite shocked because I thought, crikey, why is she getting her out of the chair to make this tea? I promised I'd make her one, and I felt really bad. Anyway, so the carer encouraged the resident to get to like a bar area, and she made some tea. And she was very shaky and spilt some sugar around. And I was quite shocked, and I went to speak to the carer after. I said, "Look, I'm unhappy about that. I promised I'd make her a cup of tea." She was clearly upset, and she was resting. And she said to me, "Listen, sunshine, I didn't do that for you." She said, "If she sits in that chair all day, everybody will walk past, she'll ask for a cup of tea, and then she won't walk, she'll feel rough, her legs will hurt, her back will hurt." She says, "By doing that," she says, "I get her walking, get her doing some exercise. She's engaged in something that she would be used to doing at home every day." And, we help people with those activities of daily living,
Yeah.
and I think at that moment, it dawned on me the real what care really does for people, the right care, and living in a care environment like a care home.
I think it's a lot of fun. If you look at our social media, if you look at our Facebook posts, they're not made up. That is what actually goes on in the
Yeah.
And I think what we can pride ourselves on, we allow people to have fun and do good things, but also, if you want to sit and watch Coronation Street, you can sit and watch Coronation Street.
Yeah.
But you've also got the option to do all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
And when I look at our Facebook, sometimes when I've had a bit of a not very nice day at work, I'll go onto the Facebook things on purpose, and I just see all the fun and everything, and I think that's why we do what we do.
Exactly. That's why we do it. Yeah.
Pauline, I don't know if you've got it in your home, but one of the best activities I'd ever seen in a care home was giant Scrabble. The words that some of the residents came up with, and it was so funny, and everybody was laughing, and and I think there was a bit of competition, obviously, with the Scrabble, but I think there was some naughty fun where the words that came. It was great. It was.
You always learn something when you go to those sorts of things, and I can get thinking, "Oh, I didn't know what that word was. Now I do."
Yeah, quite.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you both so much for joining today and talking about that.
Pleasure.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Thank you to Nino, Cuffaro and Pauline Cichy for joining us on that episode. There was some really good practical advice in there, not only when considering a care home for a loved one, but also very generally the information on lasting powers of attorney and the importance of wills was really interesting. And I'm sure there was a lot of stuff in there that many people wouldn't know, and a lot to take into consideration. Just wanted to add, if you would like to find out any more about Nino, you can Google his name, Nino Cuffaro, and he's got a YouTube channel with lots of useful tips on there. Thanks again to Nino and Pauline. Thank you for listening to the Care to Share podcast. We hope you found the information in this episode useful. You can find out more about Oakland Care at www.oaklandcare.com. You can also follow the Care to Share podcast on Instagram at care2share_podcast. Please also remember to rate and review the podcast.